that men can be victims and survivors just as well as women can. And in fact, one of the phenomenon that we know of and that we see every day is that men who are survivors, the injuries that they sustain if there is physical abuse tend to be much more severe and much more life-threatening in nature, because when women use violence in a way to control, they have some physical limitations to overcome. Women, by and large, and traditionally, are smaller than men. They have less physical strength. That's just a biological fact. So when they inflict injury on a male partner, it is much more severe because they're more likely to use a weapon. They're also more likely to use a sneak attack method so that they have a better chance of actually inflicting injury. So I am the first person to admit that men can be victims just as well as women. However, as I go through our talk today, primarily I will almost always address the survivor, she or her. I will almost always address the batterer, he or him. I really, really, really try not to be sexist in my daily life. I am married. I have 2 sons. So I'm surrounded by men. I find them highly wonderful creatures. But again, the reality that I deal with is that domestic violence is primarily a male-on-female crime. I also want to encourage you as we go through, if you have questions, comments, concerns, please feel free to speak up. Raise your hand. You guys are going to take away from today what you take away from it. And the more we interact and the more I answer your questions, the better off we're all going to be. So we'll go ahead and get started. That's all my information. You guys have a copy of the PowerPoint, so please feel free to follow along. Come on. There you are. I would also tell you my information, my contact information, all of my bio information is in the PowerPoint. If you ever need to get a hold of me, if you have questions, if you would rather email me or contact me afterwards, please feel free to do so. So why is it that I go around the state and do upwards of 50 or 60 trainings a year talking about the issue of domestic violence? Some of these numbers right here are exactly why. Last year, fiscal year 2007-2008, which was the last year we have numbers, obviously, 65 deaths in the state of Indiana due to domestic violence. And those are deaths, keep in mind, that we can directly link. So those are deaths where we know without a shadow of a doubt that person was killed in the middle of a domestic incident and they were killed by a domestic partner. These numbers include men, women, and children. We also know that the actual number is probably about double that. We're probably looking at about 125 to 130 homicides due to domestic violence last year. But those are ones that we can't directly link. We don't have a direct established link, so we can't say without a shadow of a doubt they were directly linked to domestic violence. Some other numbers in there, over 9,200 women and children served in our shelters. That doesn't count the roughly 6,000 that were turned away due to lack of resources, lack of rooms. Over 30,000 orders for protection filed in 2007. That is a huge, huge number. That was a spike. We average around 27 or 28,000, so 30,000 was a huge spike for us. But it definitely caught our attention, and we're taking a look at why those numbers spiked the way they did. And then also 108,600 calls to our emergency hotlines and our emergency numbers across the state of Indiana. So as you can see, we have a lot of issues that go on. We have a lot of survivors and families that we're seeing that are affected by domestic violence. These are some numbers that relate more to what you guys are seeing. In the healthcare field and in the medical facilities, domestic violence costs approximately $4.1 billion annually. And that's just looking at medical and mental health care services. $4.1 billion. One study documents that 37% of women seeking treatment in ERs for traumatic injuries were injured by their male partners. That's from the Department of Justice. That percentage, that actual study was done in 97, 98. That percentage has remained steady, anywhere between 35 and 40%. Homicide is the leading cause of violent death for pregnant and postpartum women. We know that in domestic violence, very often, physical violence starts at pregnancy. There will be verbal violence, there will be mental and emotional violence, but the physical violence often starts at pregnancy. And we'll talk a little bit about that. The mean medical care cost is roughly $2,600. So if she gets sustained injuries to the point where she has to go to the ER, she has to seek treatment, whether it's with a primary care physician or what have you, it's going to be $2,600, $3,000. It's going to be a substantial medical bill. When we talk about domestic violence, the first question I ask is this: what is it? Because if I say domestic violence, everyone in this room has a different picture in their head. What do you see? If I say the words domestic abuse, domestic violence, dating abuse, whatever it is, what do you see? What's your answer to that question? Somebody that's battered, physical violence. And that's fairly standard. Most people will come up with a picture with a woman wearing big sunglasses to cover a bruised, a black eye. Maybe she'll be wearing a turtleneck in the middle of summer to hide strangulation marks on her neck. Primarily, I would say 8 out of 10 times when I ask that question, physical abuse is the first sign, the first symptom. What else? Anything else that comes to mind when I say domestic violence, domestic abuse? Primarily physical? Isolation, that's another big one, and we'll talk about that. That's a huge one, especially that you may see as far as the idea of doctor shopping and preventing her from establishing any kind of support network. So we'll talk about that. That's a very good one. Criminally, when we define domestic violence within the criminal framework, this is the actual statute from the Indiana Code, and it's hard to read, and it's hard to read for a reason, because it's very, very wordy. It's a criminal definition. Unfortunately, lawyers haven't figured out how to say anything in less than 87 words. Here is what the actual criminal definition is. Domestic or family violence is defined as attempting to cause, threatening to cause, placing a family or household member in fear of physical or bodily harm, or involuntarily engage in sexual activity. That's the criminal definition, family and household member. When we define domestic violence in our field, in the domestic violence community, this is more what we look at. We look at the behavioral definition, because this is what we're concerned at. Certainly domestic violence is a crime and should be prosecuted where possible. This is more what we're concerned with, because this is what we see. This is the continual pattern that repeats itself, that cycles through generations, and that causes so many social issues that we deal with. It is a pattern of assaultive and coercive behaviors. It includes, but is not limited to, physical, sexual, psychological, or economic attacks, and it can be utilized by adults or adolescents. One of the biggest uphill battles that we face is getting folks to understand that domestic violence doesn't start when you turn 18. It doesn't start when you become an adult, when you enter into serious dating relationships, when there's actually, that idea of a future together and what have you. Much of the domestic violence that we see started, or the survivors that we see, their first violent relationship was when they were 13, 14, 15, 16 years old, and in their first dating relationship. My relationship, I entered into when I was 12. And the first question people always ask me was, you were 12! Didn't your parents realize anything? Didn't they know what was going on? How could it have been that violent if you were 12 and you were living at home and da-da-da-da? My parents didn't have a clue because I didn't want them to know. Period, straight up. They didn't have a clue because I was able to hide it from them. And I went through some pretty serious physical trauma, let alone emotional trauma, psychological trauma. My parents pretty much just wrote that off as me being a moody teenager. But I was able to hide most of what happened to me. And we'll talk a lot about why we're able to do that as survivors, because one of the first things we do as survivors, we blame ourselves. Everything is our fault, so it's our fault, or it's our problem to take care of it. We need to keep that within so we can deal with it. Nobody else needs to be bothered. And we'll talk a lot about that. Here's the bottom line. If you leave with no other idea today, please understand this. Domestic violence is about gaining and maintaining power and control. You'll hear people say, oh, well, he was angry, he was drunk, he was high, she was having an affair, this, that, or the other. No. Domestic violence is about gaining the power in the relationship and maintaining control over that partner, so that what happens, what's said, what's done, what is expected, all of that comes back to that power partner, that primary partner, and that person is the person who's in control and is determining everything that happens. It is a crime of power and control and nothing else.